Hey, I'm Bob at ILikeToMakeStuff. Today we're going to turn this stuff into this. Halloween is in just a couple of weeks, so you still have plenty of time to make a costume out of EVA foam. For me, this is just a prop, not a costume, but all of the principles and the construction are the same. Let's get into it. I'm using my lifecast here, but you could use a styrofoam head and it would work just the same. I covered the top of it with a big piece of aluminum foil and then sprayed on some spray adhesive to add more pieces. I just wanted to make sure that I had full coverage all the way down to the bottom of the neck. The foil will tear really easily, so I covered the whole thing with duct tape. This will help me cut it up into pieces for a pattern. I learned this patterning technique from Evil Ted Smith. He's got a fantastic video about making helmet patterns. Go check it out, it's linked down in the description. I started by making marks for where my brow line was, and the center of the nose, the center of the forehead, and then roughly drew in the eyes. I drew lines where I thought the different panels should be and then made some marks across those lines so that I could connect them up later. Then I started cutting down the lines to get the individual panels to make the pattern from. Now this was a best guess in my case, and I'll show you why this didn't really work in a little bit, but the principle is the same. I cut out all these different pieces, but they were formed to my head, so they needed to be flattened out. I cut some darts in these pieces so that they would lay flat. I'm not sure that I did this the right way, but it worked pretty well. Once I got them basically flat, then I laid them out on some EVA foam. I used push pins to hold these in place so that I could trace their outline with a Sharpie. And you'll notice I only made patterns for one side of the head. I flipped these pieces over and traced them again to get the opposite sides. Through this entire project, I was checking against images that I'd gotten online as a reference. It's really important to get as many different views of whatever prop or costume you're trying to make as you possibly can. I cut all these pieces of foam out, some with a knife, and then I decided to move on and use the bandsaw just to get nicer cuts. All of my initial cuts were at 90 degrees. They were perpendicular to the material, but some of these pieces actually needed to be beveled to get the shape that I wanted. For this, I used the belt sander to sand down and add a bevel to certain sides. To assemble these pieces, I used barge contact cement. You put it on two different pieces and let it dry for about 5 minutes. Then when you stick them together, they are instantly bonded. I also went over these with a heat gun. That makes it easy to bend them, and when you're reattaching these darts, you need them to form into the curve that they originally had. Once I got these pieces put back together, I needed to attach them to each other, and it was just more cement to get all of the seams lined up. I started at one end and then pressed the seam together all the way to the other end, and it was actually starting to take shape. I had to do quite a bit of sanding and beveling to get all of the seams to line up, but after a while, I got them all stuck together. At this point, I had to start modifying my original pieces. They weren't going to fit together, and a lot of the things that I thought might work before actually wouldn't work. I had to completely cut off the little ears just to glue up the main shape of the helmet. I was starting to worry at this point if it was actually going to work out, but I wanted to get the main helmet shape in place just to be sure. I started adjusting things like the nose to try to get the more correct shape, and I had to cut out an area in the chin piece. I drew out another piece to fill in that gap and make it closer to the correct shape. I cut a little notch out of the back side of this so that it could bend without having a seam on the front, and then I beveled the corners so that they would match up with the other chin pieces. So far, everything had been a bunch of separate flat planes, but I needed a lot more definition to make it start looking the right way. Based on my reference images, I drew in some marks where I thought the nose should be and the different parts of the eyes. There were actually multiple levels of depth here around the eyes, so I just drew them in with a Sharpie. I just used a knife to open these eyes up to get closer to the right shape. I also used an orbital sander with some fine grit paper to try to smooth over some of the seams between the different panels. I needed to remove some material on each side of the nose, but it had to be a hard line. I made a little sanding block with some spray adhesive, and then I held a ruler up to the line that I wanted and sanded alongside it. This guide helped me not to have a ramp, but instead a hard line sanded in the material. We're gonna stop right there. I've worked on this for about a day, and the more I look at it, it's just not right. So I compared the shape of this to the reference image, and I figured out exactly what the problem is. The patterns for this were made to match the contour of my head, but the outside of the helmet that I actually want to make is not the same shape. This one is far too rounded, and the sides don't go up far enough. I could sculpt that in, but I think I'm gonna actually start over. I reached out to Bill Doran from Punished Props to ask him what he thought I should do, and his advice was this. He told me to build up the shape of the lifecast to actually get the general shape that I want the outside of the helmet to be, then make a pattern off of that and create new foam from there. So we're gonna start over. Okay, so I've done a lot of work off camera that I haven't shown you, but essentially it's the same as the first helmet that I showed you. The shapes are just a little bit different. This is the fourth helmet that I've made of this design. Every one I've tried something different with the patterning. This one is the closest I've gotten so far, and this is the one I'm just gonna go with to continue working. If you do wanna make this specific helmet, the way that I found it works best is to put a seam right here, have 2 panels on the front, and then big side panels. And then you have a large area that's relatively flat on the top and a back panel. Like I said, this is not the final shape, but this is a pretty good place to work from. I continued to make changes based on the reference images. There was still a lot of extra material and the overall shape wasn't quite right. I used a knife and a sander to get closer to the shape that I wanted it to be. The belt sander really helps you blend where panels join in case you don't need a hard edge. Based on the reference images, I marked where I thought the little ears should go and then measured them. I transferred those sizes to some foam and cut out some pieces that were roughly the right size. I held them in place and roughly drew out the curve of the helmet. Then through trial and error, I shaped them to fit with the belt sander. Once I had it basically in place, I flipped it over and traced it as a reference and then made another one. I glued them on with contact cement. This helmet has a neck guard on the back of it, so I cut a strip of foam and then cut the right angle on one side. I figured out the length of this piece and then cut the same angle on the other end. I used a metal ruler to draw a taper from the center point out to both ends and then cut them off with a knife. When I was happy with the shape, I just used some contact cement to get it in place. To make the indentions on each side of the helmet, I just made a really shallow cut with a knife along a straight edge. And when you hit it with a heat gun, it opens up and looks like an indention. To fill the seams in between all these different panels, I just used some caulking. This stuff sets up in just a couple of minutes so you can keep working. It's really good for filling in seams in between panels, or sometimes there's just defects in the foam that you need to fill. Make sure to use a wet paper towel to get a nice smooth transition from the caulking surface to the foam surface. At this point I tried it on and it was crushing my ears, so I used a Dremel tool with a sanding drum to remove some of the material around my ears. It fit a lot better. The shape was basically done, so I needed to add some battle damage. To do this, I started with a Sharpie and a straight edge and drew the lines in all the places that I wanted there to be cuts or indentions. Then I used a blade and cut along these lines and then used a heat gun to open them up just like I did before. I wanted to seal up the foam so it would take paint and it would last a lot longer. I used latex for this, I mixed it with water to thin it out, and then I added some heavy body silver to it. I sprayed on 4 or 5 coats over a couple of days to get a nice, solid finish. Batman seems to be wearing a mask underneath his helmet, so I put a piece of paper inside this helmet and then traced out the outline. Based on the images, I drew what I thought this piece should look like and then added some extra material around the other sides. For this piece, I used 2mm black craft foam. It's the same type of foam, it's just a lot thinner. I traced this out on the foam and then I flipped it over and lined up the very center point of the chin. I traced it again and then just cut this piece out with a knife. Again, I used barge to put this in place. I just made sure that it was an even placement on both sides of the mask. Then it was time to do some weathering. And to do this, I used black acrylic paint mixed with a whole lot of water. I used a wide sponge brush to cover a big area at a time. I didn't want to leave it on too long, so I used a wet paper towel to wipe it off. I just moved from panel to panel, trying to add some texture. The paint seeps down in the defects of the foam and the cuts that you've made. It really adds an awesome character to it. Here you can see one side that's weathered compared to the side that's not. After I finished the dark weathering on the entire helmet, I went back and added some highlights. This technique is called dry brushing. To do this, I used a bright silver paint, put just a tiny bit on the brush, and then went over the high points of the helmet. This is basically supposed to mimic the edges that have gotten worn down to the bare metal. It's really easy to overdo the weathering process. You don't want to do too much or it's just going to lose its effect. Just a little bit of dry brushing goes a really long way. The last thing to add was the glowing eyes. First, I followed the same process as I did before around the chin to make some pieces of foam to go around the eyes. I traced the shape, transferred it to foam, and cut it out. At one of the local craft stores, I found these little mesh gift bags. You can still see through them, but at a distance they look like they're solid white. I folded them over to get double the thickness and then glued them onto the back of each one of these eye panels. I used some spray adhesive to hold them in place first, but then eventually had to use some hot glue to actually get all of the different layers to be held in place. I trimmed off the outside and then glued these onto the inside of the helmet. And that looked pretty cool, but they need to glow. For that, I used some simple batteries and LEDs, nothing complicated. I used 2 AA's and 6 LEDs here. I made a little piece of foam to fit inside the brow and then hot glued the LEDs 3 above each eye. I used some electrical tape to separate the leads of all the LEDs so that I could wire them up without worrying about them shorting out. I soldered all the anodes together and all the cathodes together, then I soldered on 2 pieces of wire that went directly to the battery. This is a super simple circuit, but an easy way to get LEDs. Then I hot glued this panel right above the brow, and I will say it's extremely uncomfortable on your brow, but the eyes glow. To protect the paint, I put on a couple of coats of matte clear. Then it was all done. I'm not gonna lie to you and say that this wasn't a huge amount of work, but it was totally worth it. It took 4 tries to get to this point, but I learned a whole lot about the material and about the process of making a helmet, which is just stuff that I didn't expect. So next time, I think I'll have a lot better idea how to use the form that I made to get the shapes that I want. I did use my head sculpting to make this fit my head, so technically it fits, but it actually doesn't fit very well. And the LEDs up here pushing on your brow make it pretty uncomfortable. I'll try it on for you guys, but this is probably the last time I'll ever put it on. It kind of fits, but it's extremely uncomfortable up here on the brow. I hope you like the helmet. Let me know what you think about it down in the comments below. I've got lots of other project videos and a few more foam ones that you might be interested in. Don't forget to subscribe to my main and my second channel. That's it for this one, guys. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Martha!